Welcome back, everyone, to the Gentleman's Wrestling Podcast. I'm your host, as always, Jesse Collings. And joining me today, a first time guest on the show, he's a columnist for voicesofwrestling.com. You might recognize him from Twitter. You might recognize him from appearing on many other shows on the Voices of Wrestling Network. It's Suit Williams. Suit, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good, Jesse. I'm glad to be on Gentleman's Wrestling Podcast, having a good discussion about our topic today.
Yeah, no. So, Suit, you're coming to us from Louisiana. That's correct.
Yes, yes, yes. Born and raised, mostly.
Yes, yes. So you're coming to us right from the bayou. Are there really a lot of bayous where you live? Like, is that something that you would see like walking down the street?
Not where I live, because I am in the Baton Rouge area more the Baton Rouge, like New Orleans area is where I've lived, but you can get to some bayous pretty quick if you just start heading south. You'll get to some very southern places because Louisiana, it is basically New Orleans, Baton Rouge, and then a
Yeah.
lot of country, and a lot of swamp.
The I, I've talked about this before, but like a really disproportionate amount of people on the Voices of Wrestling Network um are from either the Northeast or like the Great Lakes region.
Yeah,
And I talked about this with Joe Gagney before, where it's like if we were in the territory area, we would be very like lopsided because we'd only most of us would only be able to see like Vince McMahon's WWF and Vern
yeah.
Gagne's AWA, and like we'd be really relying on people like you Suit to be like sending us Bill Watts tapes because we're not very geographically diverse, despite having 30 plus contributors.
I'd be the one person shouting about JYD.
Yeah, you'd be telling us like the stories, and we'd be like, "That's not true. They didn't have 29,000 people there." Blah, blah. Like, uh, it would be a different time. But thankfully, through the power of the internet, we're all connected, and we can have a wide range of perspectives and guests available to us. And the topic I want to talk about today is, especially in the wake of what's happened over the last few weeks and kind of the narratives that have broken out about AEW. But the general topic is, has AEW lost its identity? Or maybe lost is too strong of a term, but is AEW having a problem with its identity in terms of what kind of product it is offering currently and kind of what kind of product historically it has offered and what kind of fan base it has kind of targeted? And I think the general theme that I think a lot of people have with AEW, at least the circles that I'm in, and it's probably very different to other people, but at least what I see a lot is AEW starts out with the idea of being a real alternative to WWE and presenting its product very, very differently than WWE. But over time, through a number of factors, kind of WWE isms have kind of sneaked into the product. I think the current MJF character is a big example as someone that would probably exist more commonly on an episode of Raw or SmackDown as opposed to Dynamite. And I think some fans are having a hard time feeling like AEW is still the alternative product and not just something that's trying to be like WWE, which has kind of historically been the big question of what AEW would look like. Would it be just like another WWE or would it be something completely different? Um, and I'll ask you this question first, Suit. Before AEW started, when it was just an idea, when it was just an announcement on being the elite, and maybe they had a little press conference in Jacksonville, what was kind of your thoughts on what you thought AEW would be from like a product standpoint? Like what were your expectations for this new all elite wrestling company in terms of what it was going to offer as a wrestling product?
My hope for what AEW would be just, I don't want to say like a meat and potatoes pro wrestling company, but I wanted like a New Japan style of wrestling in an American wrestling format. So, and you, something important to remember at the time, WWE in 2019 was terrible. Like I review every WWE pay per view for the website now. I don't know why. No one told me to. I just do it. But even like saying that, I can tell you definitively WWE in 2023 is so much better than WWE in 2019. There was just a major lack of basic competence being told by WWE in 2019. So for AEW to come in and to be bringing in these big names, and for Tony Khan, the more we learned about Tony, the more we learned like what kind of a wrestling fan he was. I was hoping for, a product that not only had like, the basics, competency, decent storytelling, the ability to create new stars, but I was hoping for just the high match quality that we get out of New Japan on a more regular basis in a more American wrestling format. And over time, I've kind of learned that I prefer the New Japan format, and that it's kind of not pop like it would be very hard to do that in an American format. But at the start of AEW and like throughout the first, we'll say through 2021, they did a very good job of hitting like what I think was the highest tier of American wrestling on television.
I think, yeah, like when I think something that AEW was always going to be up against when it first started was there were all these people that wanted AEW to be whatever they personally felt was missing in like major American pro wrestling, right? There was this idea that some people wanted it to be like you said, kind of like a New Japan, like real sports themed professional wrestling company. Some people wanted it to be like, you know, Mid South Wrestling or Jim Crockett Promotions in the 80s. Some people wanted it to be um, just like WWE with a few minor changes. I feel some people want it to be like the Attitude Era of WWE. People just want there was all this thought into thinking AEW is going to be the company that provides what I think is missing in wrestling, even though collectively all of those thoughts would contradict one another. It can't be like the Attitude Era WWE, but also be like modern New Japan, but also be like, Mid South Wrestling. Like those visions do not um work together on the same screen. So it kind of had to be something or another. And inevitably, you were going to kind of alienate some fans who would become very, very disappointed very quickly that AEW didn't
And
meet their specific expectation.
and you kind of saw that those clashing visions on the actual product, because in those early days of AEW, when multiple people were having their visions on the screen, you saw the clash sometimes like segment from to segment. You would have Cody doing you know his Southern wrestling, his Mid South style. You'd have the Young Bucks doing like their PWG style stuff. You'd have, a lot of hardcore stuff. There were a lot of things that like they didn't clash as much as they just didn't fit all the way together. Like there were puzzle pieces there and they didn't just click into place. Like there
Do you
would be
think
a
that
point
was
where like the gumbo there would be a point where like the puzzle would be put together, but they just didn't have a way of getting them in the right spots yet.
were you going to make a gumbo reference?
I was it a little hackneyed, so I pivoted to the
Oh, come on.
to the
I
puzzle.
want you to adhere to Louisiana stereotypes. Damn it, suit. Um, but do you think that was really a bad thing though? Like if we were to go back and were to see like this great diversity from it would be kind of odd on a show, but was it really like a bad thing that you had like a lot of different types of wrestling and different types of storytelling being displayed as opposed to one rigid format.
I wouldn't. It's that wouldn't necessarily be bad. Like there is the common talking point in wrestling that wrestling's got to be a variety show, and I think having wrestling being a variety of styles and a variety of um like different methods of doing it is better than wrestling be trying to be SNL. But just the way it was done in early AEW was kind of like it was more jarring than kind of trying to find a way to say it. Like it didn't flow together well. Like there would be segments where one thing is told in one specific voice, and then the next segment it would have something in a different voice, but the voice was so different that it was kind of just hard to connect the two in the same universe. So
Yeah.
it's not like necessarily a bad idea. It's just one where it would need more ironing out. And I think through time they would have gotten there.
And
But
you could argue that like the effectiveness of each story was hampered by the fact that they were jumping around from segment to segment with all these kind of themes, almost like you're flipping channels. Like you turn on one channel, let's say you're flipping through like your HBO package, and it's like, oh, I'm on the HBO comedy page. Oh, now I'm on the HBO horror. Now I'm on the HBO family. Now I'm on the HBO Espanol. Like it would be all these different things back to back to back, and you would never, it would hurt kind of your individual investment in each segment if you felt like they weren't as connected to anything else that was happening on the show. And I think, AEW stepped into a really unique space in terms of being this national wrestling product with really no the fans had no idea what to expect from it. There was no history of it. And I do think that's a factor now in 2023 that didn't exist in 2019, 2020, which is we now have a set expectation for what AEW looks like, what it feels like, what makes it different than WWE or other wrestling products. And we have a loyal fan base that tunes in every week, that buy pay-per-views, every other month or every month, that go to shows. We have a base audience that is, going to appears to be going to stick with AEW for the most part, um, for the time being. And now AEW has to kind of cater to what that audience's expectations are. And kind of the argument that I'm seeing a lot lately is that AEW is maybe putting that audience on the back burner and chasing after the bigger and perhaps more lucrative WWE audience, which is changing the show a little bit and changing some of the characters and presentation to be more attractive to your conventional WWE fan, as opposed to the original concept of the company, which in a lot of ways was very anti WWE.
yeah, I have this note down. I took a few notes before we started, kind of just getting some thoughts out on paper. And one thing I was the company when it started in 2019, a lot of the people, a majority of people had the same vision for what they wanted AEW to be. They wanted it to be the challenger brand. They wanted it to be an alternative. And that thought process, you saw it from the people on screen, you saw it from the people, in production. They were doing different things, making the show look different, making the show feel different, and it worked. And they were very successful starting on. They earned a pay-per-view audience that has been stable to this day, that is incredibly successful for wrestling in 2023, but really since for a non WWE promotion, there hasn't been a company this sustainable on pay per view since WCW in 1999, maybe that late if you want to be generous to them. So what they built with that vision was successful, but as time goes on, as people cycle out and cycle in, as less of that original like roster of people on both sides of the screen, stay, they move on, they retire, new people come in, those people don't necessarily understand that vision of being an alternative. So they're just in their minds being like, okay, what works? And what works, what has worked, is what WWE has done. So it's not even necessarily like, oh, what you guys do doesn't work. This is what does. It's just people coming in that don't understand the original vision or haven't had it like put to them in a certain way where it's like, oh, okay, so we're trying to be different. We're trying something different to show that something different can be done instead of, well, they're successful, so we have to do what's also successful.
Right. And I think this is something that me and Garrett Kidney talked about months ago when we were talking about kind of like the legacy of TNA and Impact Wrestling, which was TNA always had this kind of identity crisis where they kind of always ended up trying to be like WWE. And a huge reason because of that was whenever they were looking for somebody to lead creative, it was often somebody who came from WWE or maybe WCW, but someone like a Vince Russo or Bruce Pritchard or Dusty Rhodes or these people whose, you know, ability to identify what was successful. John Gaborick is another one. Um, would be what they knew was WWE, and so they tried to present a WWE-like product for TNA Impact, which really didn't suit that company that well because they needed to be different because they weren't WWE. And AEW is in a lot of ways the same boat, but it's difficult to get um high quality professional minds in wrestling that haven't gone through WWE because WWE is one of the only places that produces names that would be like impressive on a CV. Um, and that was always the problem. Like Dixie Carter running TNA Impact, not really knowing that much about pro wrestling, you logically would say like, all right, we need somebody to be the creative person. Let's get somebody from WWE. They're the most successful company. They're the only company that's really producing a weekly American television show besides us. Um, let's bring that person in and give them free reign. And then so you end up with a WWE influenced product, whether or not you were trying to do that intentionally or not. A lot of people will have been talking about, AEW hires, Mike Mansory last December. He's their new senior vice president and co-executive producer, and has a huge role in kind of the production elements of the show. And a lot of people think that is WWE influenced because he was seen as a big WWE guy um, when he was working with WWE. And there's those kind of elements you can talk about, like Jeff Jarrett, who comes from WWE. You could talk about a few other people, like the producers, um, that have come over in recent, last year or two that had experience in WWE. And inevitably, when you bring all these people backstage, you end up with a WWE like flavor to your product and maybe not a full understanding of the original vision, like you were touching on. And part of it might be intentional, which is like, we got to do what WWE does because they're successful. But part of it is just the fact that if you want to hire people with experience, you probably have to hire them from WWE in a lot of cases. And those people inevitably are going to be channeling some WWE philosophy when they begin work in AEW.
Yeah, and like that touches on like a point that the guys from the Grapple podcast would make a lot. Like um, back in the day, as AEW was like starting and growing and hitting these like high watermarks for success, but there was always just like they they were touching on Raw and they were touching on NXT. They were beating NXT. Remember those days? But they were touching on Raw and like it was getting close where AEW was challenging WWE, but they weren't surpassing them. And a point that I would hear a lot was, what can AEW do to get to that next level? And I think that thought process kind of like it discounts that WWE's like got the, they've got a 50-year head start. They've got the advantages of being, they are wrestling to a lot of people. They are the name promotion. Like Kleenex is tissue, like Google is search engines, WWE is wrestling. And AEW doing what they did, they were challenging that and they were successful, but they were never going to have that like that time, that investment in them because they had just started. My thought was always it's going to take time. It's going to take a generation shift in wrestling fans. It's going to take, that next TV deal and the one after that for AEW to really just grow on what they had done. And I think instead they see, okay, we kind of plateaued. Maybe we need to try something else to kind of move on top of that. And instead, it's kind of stagnating, if not going down, if the TV ratings or anything. But that could be going down with the rate of cable as well. So if anything, it's not growing, and what they're doing is at best stagnating the company.
Yeah, it's a really interesting thought in that sense of you hit like you mentioned like a plateau. Like we've kind of peaked out what we think our current audience, the audience of people who have watched AEW and enjoy it and will watch regularly, seems to have had a cap. Um, and how do you reach new people? And you kind of your whole argument is like WWE has this institutional aspect of the company, it's generation, multi generations of fans and things like that. And you're never really going to be able to replicate. The only thing you can really do to replicate that is to be around for that long and to be prominent for that long. And there's no shortcut to really doing that. Um, and so there has to be like a patience involved. And what you're saying here is that there might be a little bit of impatience in the sense of, all right, we're going to have, if we want to grow, we got to see what WWE is doing because there's still, you know, a million wrestling fans each week who are tuning into Raw and SmackDown that aren't tuning into Dynamite. And how can we capture those fans, which is something every non WWE wrestling company has asked itself over the years. And does that end up with changing the product at all? Um, and let's move to like MJF here because obviously you wrote a column for voicesofwrestling.com, which people can read now. It's called I'm Not Mad, I'm Disappointed, an MJF column. And in that column suit, you kind of talk a lot about the kind of evolution of MJF's character, especially now that he has turned babyface, and how he has gone from being like this modern day Roddy Piper, smart heel kind of guy to being like this over the top cartoon character that is in these, goofy backstage vignettes and segments that would fit right at home on a show like NXT or Raw or SmackDown, or is just a very WWE based character. And given that he is the world champion and that he is the person who is by far the most heavily promoted and pushed person in AEW, that seems to have a much larger influence on the rest of the product. Um, and there's a decent amount of concern from people that it's turning them off of the product because it's so WWE-like, and it's not particularly good. But at the same time, he's very over in the buildings, and it seems like his character in the conventional sense is working. Um, but kind of take me through kind of what your feelings were and why you kind of decided to write that column last week.
Yeah, the MJF stuff, it really let me down, like how MJF, because he's always had kind of like that I don't want to say a WWE veneer, but he's always like leaned more on the entertainment side because, he's a very good talker. He's, entertaining, quippy guy. And that worked when he was, the top, well, one of the top heels in the company and rising through the ranks. And, you know, he was very entertaining. Like I would always, enjoy the MJF segments. And then, when this turn came with the Adam Cole story, things kind of changed in that regard because you got the goofy little skits, and I wrote about this in the piece where I was like I didn't like them, but I figured they were getting to a point where okay, this is the world title feud, things are gonna get serious, we're gonna hit the hard left and get real, and that didn't happen. Him and Cole, they stayed friends, we keep getting these segments, and now it got to a point where I was just like, what are we doing? What's the end game? Like, and throughout the whole thing, MJF was getting, I don't want to say lazier because I'm sure he like put some effort in, but his work felt like he was not trying. Like he was doing the sing along with the champ stuff. He was doing the simple call and response stuff that, it worked. It worked in the buildings. It was over, but it did not feel up to the caliber of, wrestler or performer that MJF had shown us to be. And so I wrote out that column, just kind of listing out like why I felt so let down by this guy, like why I felt like he was just not living up to his potential through his own choices, because it's known that MJF, as a top star in AEW, he's got a lot of control over what he does. So it felt like a lot of this was stuff that he was doing that just did not measure up to what he was capable of. So I wrote the piece and I just listed everything out. Uh, um, my favorite line in there was he calls himself Piper in Portland, more like Mazanin in Stanford. Like he was a full on WWE cartoon character, and I felt like that was beneath him. And this week, I put that column out. Alan Forel, who's famously positive about pro wrestling, was very frustrated. He tweeted about it. MJF, like, I don't want to sit here and say that we like that like my word or Alan's tweets got to MJF, but he put out a tweet talking about how he needed to be better and he would start being better. And then this past Tuesday on Dynamite, he cut, a very serious, you know, very good up to his standard promo against Jay White. He left the tofu stuff and the call and response. He left that behind, and he cut a great promo on MJF.
Some
And
some
on,
some would say too serious.
well, that was the juice stuff. But before then, he did some very good stuff, and you know, to sit here and like say thank you, say like you're welcome would be very arrogant of me, but it it felt like we were getting back to the MJF, a different version of the MJF that we were getting at the start of the company, rising through the ranks before he got to the top. So,
Well,
as far as like my yeah,
you heard it here,
yeah.
folks. If you are happy that MJF's career has been saved, you can just thank Suit Williams for doing it. Suit, do you have a Venmo or a PayPal account you want to share? If people want to send you some money for turning MJF's career around.
My Cash App is on my Twitter profile. If you don't if you hate me, pay me. I have the Vince Staples mindset of if you pay me $1 million, you'll never hear from me again.
Yeah.
So
The well, I think one thing your column I think touches on really well, which is that when this whole MJF's babyface turn started with his feud with Adam Cole, there even if you didn't like the some of the dopey backstage segments they were doing, and I thought they ranged in quality greatly. Um, it was intriguing, this whole idea of, is MJF gonna turn on Adam Cole? Is Adam Cole secretly playing MJF? What's gonna happen at Wembley Stadium? Like, it felt like it was really this fascinating moment where we didn't know where these characters were heading, but we knew that there was something big was going to happen. And since then, perhaps because the angles were so popular, um, we now have moved on to this thing where like MJF and Adam Cole are just friends, but their friendship is constantly strained by like Roddy Strong needing Adam Cole's attention. And it just feels like it's lost a lot of that intrigue, and what we're left with is just like the bad backstage vignettes and Adam Cole doing these terrible backstage pre-tapes with Roderick Strong, um that feel really out of place on AEW programming. And so I feel like it's really
What, Jesse? You don't like watching Adam Cole mow a lawn in slow motion?
no, I don't.
That's not
I
your
mean,
bag?
I so like if we go back in time and like if we go back to like the kind of like the the vignette, the backstage, I keep calling them backstage, but they're pre-tapes, the pre-taped
Yeah.
vignette of like Adam Cole and MJF working out at the gym or whatever as they're getting ready for like the tag team tournament and things like that. They were goofy, but it's like whatever. They're like, I understand the story that they're telling here, and I understand why they're got to show like why you should be invested. They're trying to show you why you should be invested in these characters working together. Um, but now it's like, oh, Adam Cole is just like trapped at Roderick Strong's house because Roderick Strong, you know, is wearing a hospital. What do they call those, hospital gowns?
Hospital gown? Yeah.
Don't they call them like bobbies or something like that? Maybe that's like
I
a
don't know the
British term.
technical term.
But anyway, he's wearing like a hospital gown all the time, and like Adam Cole apparently has been from what we can tell has been stuck at Roderick Strong's house for weeks. Um, and he also needs to get like emergency surgery, but he can't get it. And MJF needs him. You want to know, this sucks for Adam Cole as just a person. Like Adam Cole, he's got all these people that just can't function without him for a single second. Um, God knows what his girlfriend thinks, who's dropped off the face of the earth. Uh, but it seems like we're now like we don't know where this is building towards, because it seems like MJF eventually one of them is still probably going to turn on the other, but that seems to be something that's going to happen in like 6 months after a bunch of other storyline stuff happens. And who knows, because it seems like Adam Cole's going to be out for quite a long period of time with his ankle injury. um
Yeah. Well, it the Cole and MJF's pre-tapes, those were silly, but those you felt like had a point of these two are teaming, they are bonding, and they are trying to become the best tag team they can to win either set of tag team titles. And it's kind of building up the relationship so that when it ends, there is an emotional like hook to it.
and it worked because
That
people felt
yeah.
that in the matches and stuff like that.
And I was into it. Like going into the collision match, going into those dynamites, I was waiting for the turn. I was waiting for the coin to drop, and I was excited for it, even though I didn't like the way they were like not the method of what they were getting there, but I just didn't find the skits to be funny. Like it wasn't my type of humor. And so while that was, not optimal for me, I was still into the story. But now we're at a point where, okay, these two are friends, but they are against Roderick Strong and the Kingdom. Now, like, it doesn't make, like, this thing doesn't make sense. Like, Adam Cole's just stuck at Roderick Strong's house. He can't just get up and leave. Like, it,
Yeah, like
I
he's
don't
it,
know.
it
It
it makes
doesn't make
Adam Cole
sense.
look it makes Adam Cole look really stupid. Like obviously
Yeah,
it's
it's
killing Roderick Strong's credibility, but it also makes it like, well, Adam Cole's been here for weeks and he needs to get emergency surgery and he's really dumb because he keeps falling for like Roderick Strong constantly saying he needs him for forever and ever. Like it the characters feel inhuman, which I think is again a
yes.
WWE trait, not an AEW trait. Because like to me, the major distinction between AEW and WWE historically is that the AEW characters feel more realistic and less cartoonish.
Well,
Um,
they feel like humans, and humans don't stay at people's houses for a week when they need surgery. Like they go get the surgery,
you're right.
which is like not to get into fantasy booking or anything, but I don't think Adam Cole is hurt. I think him and the Kingdom were the mystery attackers on Jay White, and I think they're gonna turn heel. I don't like at this point. I don't get how it would make sense for the story. Like it would take a lot of explanation for any of it to make sense. But MJF retaining the ROH tag titles makes me think, okay, the Kingdom are going to end up with those, and Cole's going to turn on, and those four are going to be a heel group for MJF to go against. That's my thought.
Can we
Maybe
get
I'm
there?
right.
Because that
Maybe I'm
sounds
wrong.
okay. Can we get
Yeah,
there?
I would love to get there. I like. Can we get there at Full Gear? That's like what, a month away.
Yeah,
Like
like
the
four
fewer
weeks.
of these pre-tapes I have to watch, the better. Because like they're just Adam Cole, like these skits with Strong, they have really like early YouTube energy where it's like there's no punchline. It's just guys acting like goofs, and like there's no point where I'm like supposed to get the joke. The joke
Oh,
is that these
it's
silly things are happening.
yeah, to me, it's exactly like what you would see like on the NXT vignettes and the backstage little skits that they do.
I
Uh,
literally compared them in the column. Like I've had an MJF and Cole segment up against I think it was Io Shirai and Zoe Stark at Eating Sushi. I had another one against like a Thea Hale back like vignette. Like you put them side by side, they look like they're part of the same show.
yeah, and to get this kind of brings us back to like the conversation about identity and things like that. When and you mentioned like MJF, fancied himself like Piper in Portland, but he's like the Miz in Stanford instead. And it was kind of like when MJF was heel MJF and he was going out there and he was cutting his promos. I would get the impression where it'd be like, how could this guy go to WWE? Like his promo style is so different than what you see in WWE. He's clearly, able to cut his own promos and he's not, doing what a writer tells him to do or things like that. And he's so different than like the other talkers in WWE that I just can't picture this version of him being in WWE. And now it's completely the opposite, where I'm like, yeah, the whole call and response thing and the whole like, trying to get the crowd to chant tofu and things like that. That's now it looks like he'd be a perfect fit for WWE. And that is a huge difference in the presentation of MJF. And since he's the world champion and he's heavily pushed on the AEW programming, it feels like a huge shift in AEW programming, and kind of the identity of AEW, even though it's really just kind of one guy. People will point to other people on the roster, but it's really him that's the driving force in making this company feel like it's similar to WWE. Like you don't get that sense when we're watching Bryan Danielson or John Moxley or Hangman or the Young Bucks or a lot of these other people. It's really an MJF problem for the most part.
Yeah, and another issue that, not to make this the MJF bash session, because again, he's a great wrestler, and when he's on, he's great.
No, it's why it's
But
frustrating.
yeah, that's why it's frustrating. But um, man, what was the point I was about to make? That slipped away.
Ah, the pesky
It was
the
some, yeah,
the
it was
pesky
some
mind
about.
reels.
Oh, I got it back. I
All
got it
right,
back.
glad.
It's that the MJF character had felt like kind of cool. Like he was lame, but he was also kind of cool. Like he
He
was
was
lame in a wrestling bad guy way. He was, you know, kind of a dork. He would do his like singing stuff and he would look like a jerk, but he would also look like, he believed he was cool and he like felt like someone he felt like someone that
he was someone where like a non-fan could walk into the room and you can put in like, oh, he's cutting a promo or he's doing something. And a non-fan, I feel like you could like easily explain his character and they would find him entertaining as opposed to
yeah,
being like a total goofball.
yeah, and with the recent stuff after like I'll limit it to after Wembley. That's when I'll limit it to. The stuff with the kangaroo kick and the stuff with the bad nicknames, it all just didn't was so uncool. It was so just like it was kind of embarrassing. And for a guy to ship like that so quickly was just jarring. And it just because he's better than that. He can do better than that. And it did not feel like he was trying. It's like, all right, let's get through this so we could get to the next step of the Brochacho story or get to the next title defense, which, you know, I think that was the big turn for me because the Samoa Joe stuff he treated with some reverence, he treated important. It meant something to him. The Jay White stuff is where like the tofu stuff started, and he was just that's where the key turn for me, where it's like, okay, now he's treating the world title feuds like jokes. And that's where that turn happened. And that's what got me to put my feelings down on paper about it.
Right.
But again, this week he's treating it seriously. And I have a feeling he's going to be treating it very seriously the next few weeks.
And I think you mentioned something earlier in this discussion. This is not MJF related, but it's you said that when we talked about like expectations for what AEW was supposed to look like in 2019, and you mentioned that how negative the perception of WWE was in 2019, even from its own fan base. And that's very different than today. The perception of WWE today in 2023 is miles better than it was in 2019. They have a much
Right.
better relationship with their fan base. You don't get the fans taking over the shows anymore. You don't have the fans, booing the top baby faces. You don't really get that much anymore in WWE. And if you go back and watch some of those like late 2010s WWE shows, it's amazing to see how like apathetic the crowd is towards almost all the acts. Um, there's still some of those tenements sticking around, especially during like long matches. Fans don't really care about that. They care about the turn and the interference and stuff like that. But the fan base is way more engaged now. The perception of Triple H being in charge as opposed to Vince McMahon really is the key factor in that and how they've um gotten their fan base to have a much more optimistic view about the company over the long term, which it had turned extremely pessimistic back in 2019. And what that has done is taken fans who were open-minded to an alternative product in 2019 and either taken them away from AEW or like, well, I don't have to watch AEW anymore because WWE is giving me what I want. But also at the same time, those fans are who, even if they're still watching AEW or they're still going to AEW shows, um, they are way more into WWE than they were a few years ago. There's more aspects of WWE that are over that aren't that didn't exist in 2019. Like you get people doing like the LA night yeah thing before shows. And that was something that WWE had no character that was like that in 2019 that was popular enough to kind of have that kind of reaction in an AEW show. Um, I know like John Moxley, he did a curb stomp uh, during his match
At Grand Slam.
at Grand Slam, right? Yeah, well, I was just thinking it was at Wrestle Dream, but I was like, no, he didn't wrestle at Wrestle Dream. He did the curb stomp at Grand Slam, and you had, all you could audibly hear the people singing the Seth Rollins theme song, and it was like that would have never happened in 2019, but in 2023, WWE Seth Rollins' theme song is much more over than it was in 2019. So, and when you do his when Moxley does his signature move, that's what's going to happen. And so you see those elements, and that's kind of all out of AEW's control in a lot of ways, right? Like AEW really can't control how popular WWE becomes, and it's kind of inevitable
Right.
because they do share a lot of the same fans. I think that was a perception that I don't know if people think all the time, is that like there are, I would say, a vast majority of AEW fans suit are people that also have, at the very least, a neutral appreciation of WWE, if not outright fandom for WWE. I think if you go to an AEW show, a majority of the audience would be cool with going to a WWE show in the same market. Maybe some prefer AEW, maybe some prefer WWE, but I think, um, especially in this space, and especially in some of the circles you and I swim in, we get the perception that like your typical AEW fan hates WWE and hates, their presentation of their product, but that's really not true. That's a small segment of the hardcore fan base. I think the general AEW fan, especially now, as opposed to in 2019, the fan today has a much more positive view on WWE and doesn't have like this huge opposition to what they're doing.
That Triple H, getting in charge, and Vince McMahon, that 6 month retirement, that was a major shift for this whole thing because, you know, I agree with your point, Jesse, that a lot of AEW fans, are fans that want to like WWE. Mike Spears of the Open the Voice Gate podcast, he has, the theory of a lot of fans just want WWE to be 5% better. And in 2019, people were frustrated. Like Vince wasn't going away, Roman wasn't going away. You had so many just people were begging for like change. Like they were rooting for Seth Rollins, they were rooting for Braun Strowman, they just wanted something to shake the snow globe in WWE
I mean, that's why the
instead of,
Fiend got
you
over,
know,
right? Like the Fiend got over just because he was
yeah.
so different, even though it was like objectively terrible.
And I've got a point about the Fiend too that I'll get to, but things would always, turn back around to Roman versus Brock. Like I was at WrestleMania 34 in 2018, main event of that show, Roman Reigns versus Brock Lesnar. Nobody cared. No, they didn't even care to boo. They didn't care to, you know, like hijack the show. I was in a Superdome full of apathetic people bouncing around beach balls and not giving a damn about the match happening in front of them.
Yeah,
And
was that
then
the beach ball match?
it was the WrestleMania 34, yeah, the main
Right, because
event.
I'm trying to think. There's also the WrestleMania main event between Triple H and Roman Reigns that nobody cared about.
That was WrestleMania 32, one of, like, due to circumstances with me being in college at the time as well, one of the worst shows I've ever watched. Just,
Right, and that was,
man,
but I remember,
when a 7 hour show peaks at the opener, that's a problem.
right, but I remember, you're talking about like the Brock Lesnar Roman Reigns match, and
Yeah.
just the basically by 2019, like the crowd, WWE crowd had largely given up in trying to like get someone new over. Because if you go
Yes.
back like 6 years prior, 2012, 2013, and you think about like, obviously, Brian Danielson was the big like point person for like the crowd kind of getting someone over, but you also had people like Dolph Ziggler and Zack Ryder And
The
these,
Shield.
yeah, well, the Shield got a real push.
Well,
They
yeah,
they
that.
clearly wanted them to be over, but you had these guys who, like who kind of organically got over in the mid card because the fans believed in them and wanted to see them do better. And once WWE made it very clear that they saw these people at a certain level, um, that just happened time after time again with various different acts and talent that people largely lost interest in them. And so you had this whole thing where not only were your top stars like Roman Reigns not getting the desired reaction, you also lost like any kind of organic momentum because people had been taught to not rally behind somebody because as long as Vince was in charge, they weren't going to get a push, a sincere push. And even if they did get a slight push, we all just knew it was a matter of time before like Brock Lesnar squashed them or something like that. And I
And
think
that whips around to my point because in 2019, the week Dynamite debuted, I think it was 4 days later, the Sunday. That was Hell in a Cell 2019. That was the Fiend versus Seth Rollins in the cage, and that was where it was just like, oh my god, like we're like, I think the show ended with people chanting AEW because they were done. Like they had killed the Fiend there, and then the Fiend went on to lose the belt to Goldberg, who ended up losing it to Brock Lesnar. And while I like those matches, that certainly wasn't going to help WWE with like their fan base who wanted new stars and kept getting the people that they were tired of. And that propelled AEW because AEW was new, it was fresh. They were giving you different people, they were giving you, the energy, they were giving people the feeling that they were listening and they just wanted to be heard. But then Vince Vince packs his bags and flees town. Triple H is the new cool uncle. He watches Dragon's Gate. He knows all these people. And all of a sudden, now they're being listened to. Now there's a feeling of hope. And now, all of a sudden, WWE, with a slight, uptick in quality, they've got the momentum. Now their fans feel heard. And now, it's AEW kind of on the back foot.
right, and I think in AEW's responsibility is to kind of pivot into a way um that I guess like reacts to that uptick in popularity in WWE. And I think that kind of gets back to our original point, which is do you try to cultivate the existing WWE fans by presenting a more WWE like product, or do you go in a completely different direction? Because as we've learned through things like the collisions that run head to head with WWE live events do significantly worse than ones that are not opposed directly by WWE. We saw on Tuesday, at least, NXT did a better number than Dynamite, although that's probably an outstanding circumstance given all of the stuff that WWE put on NXT. But the point is that you've got some evidence that shows the fan base is the kind of shared fan base that you have with WWE. Those fans in a greater number are going to pick WWE over your product every time,
Right.
even if the product is not particularly good on the WWE end. It's just their loyalty to WWE comes first. Um, and so
Those,
do
oh, go
instead,
ahead.
yeah, just instead, do you try to go, okay, we got to go in as different a direction as possible because we might be able to get some of the WWE fans in passing, but we'll never have their true loyalty. And as long as WWE is committed to running head to head with us during different times, that's not a soup as valuable fan base to have and to cater towards, as opposed to a more loyal AEW first fan base.
Yeah, those fans that were angry at WWE that came over to AEW. Now, WWE listened to them. Now they're being heard, at least on the surface level, with Triple H being the public face of WWE. We don't know how much power he really has in the company, but, you know, on the surface, you see Triple H, with these job titles of head of creative. You see Triple H, as the face of the company on these like post-show press conferences, now they're being listened to. Now they have, you know, their first choice is, you know, their first choice isn't pissing them off now. So they're going to go back to the first choice. And somebody tweeted me earlier this week when I tweeted about the rating, the AEW and NXT ratings. They tweeted me a clip from Moneyball, and it was a clip where they're uh, sitting around. It's the scouting scene from Moneyball, where they're sitting around talking about the scouts, and Billy Bean is looking at everybody, and he's just like, "Guys, if we play like the Yankees in here, we will lose to the Yankees out there." And I felt like that quote was just so apt for this situation. If you try to be like them in the room, you're going to lose to them when you end up on Tuesday nights. And maybe they would have lost to them regardless. But, you know, leaning more into their tendencies and trying to get their fan base to, you know, feel comfortable in what you're doing, it's only going to send them to the actual place that'll make them feel comfortable. It's only going to send them back to, the people that do what they do longer than you've done it. So you have to, you know, that's not going to work for you. So try a different route. It may not work either, but this won't work now.
Yeah, I think that there's um this kind of like, so I mean the Tuesday night kind of battle, like I don't find that those numbers particularly relevant just because they seem like a real uh outstanding case in terms of AEW moving to a different night and WWE obviously going all out, and
Cena's
AEW.
not, yeah, Cena's not showing up on
Yeah,
Tuesdays
to me,
anymore.
like, we can't freak out about the numbers, but what I do see is basically, AEW losing, especially the total viewer gap, which was very large, gave basically everyone a chance to say, this is what's wrong with AEW, and they need to do X, Y, and Z. Otherwise, they're going to be killed by WWE or something like that. And it's kind of like people with very different thoughts. Whatever people think is wrong with AEW can be fixed, and it can be fixed because in the kind of, I guess, like the Tuesday night ratings gave them a reason to tee off on AEW. So you have some people on one corner who are like, it's because they're too much like WWE. You have to be different. You have to get away from all this WWE like stuff on the programming. You have to get rid of Mike Mansouri and all these other people that only think WWE. You have to be as different as possible because WWE is always going to come ahead of you in doing their thing, kind of like what you just said, Sue, right? If you play like the Yankees in here, we're
Yeah.
going to lose the Yankees out there. Um, and on the flip side, the complete opposite end, you have these other people who are like, this is because AEW is too focused on wrestling and not focused on stories. And they need to be more like WWE in order to capture that WWE audience, which is clearly, those fans are clearly more invested in WWE because they tell stories and whatever. Um, and so it's kind of like whatever you think. It's like the casual fan argument, which the casual fan argument obviously usually um comes down to whatever someone individually thinks is missing in wrestling is projected onto the beliefs of the much wider casual fan uh base. And so you can say, oh, the casual fan wants more, stories and less in-ring wrestling, and the only way to cultivate the casual fan is to be like this. And other people are saying, well, casual fans, you need to get, more action packed and be less like WWE because the casual fan's going to pick WWE every time if the products are too similar. And I'm not really like gonna like pass judgment on which like side I think is right or wrong, but I think it just gave the results from Tuesday night gave everyone an opportunity to kind of voice what they think is wrong with AEW. And I often think that we're kind of back to where we were in 2019, where everyone just thinks whatever they want AEW to be is obviously the right thing for AEW to be. And I'm not sure if there's a clear and obvious direction that AEW should be going in to um cultivate a wider audience and to become, I guess, more competitive with WWE, or at least less reliant on WWE ups and downs for their own business.
Yeah, it's a lot of confirmation bias. Like what I think will work.
Right.
And
And Tuesday night was evidence of course, this is why they failed, because they're doing this.
right. But there's a lot more evidence, like historically, there's a lot more evidence to, you know, the point of, diverging from WWE tactics than going moving further into WWE tactics. So, we talked about TNA earlier, where it's like, they tried to do WWE and they couldn't grow beyond a certain point. You look at WCW toward the end, where it was very just, there were a lot of problems with WCW at the end. But part of it was trying to look and feel more like WWE after, the ratings war was lost and the tide had turned. You bring in Russo and he just makes the show feel more New York than Southern, and you lose more of the fan base that you had. So historically speaking, like if you look at the past failed attempts, they went one way. Do you continue down that way, or do you try another path? Do you walk the road less traveled?
Yeah, I think something that think uh that I think is interesting in regards to this kind of relationship between AEW and WWE, and something that it kind of gets lost in the shuffle sometimes is the I yeah, we focus a lot on, I think, like, what is the identity of the product, and is it MJF doing these goofy segments? Is it John Moxley bleeding all the time? Is it the Young Bucks doing all these flips? And I do think, like, at a macro level, we often talk about in like big sweeping terms, which is like people now view the product as this, or people now view the product as this because they see something. But realistically, I feel like if you talk to people that have like a limited experience watching AEW, or even like a limited experience watching wrestling, and they stumble across AEW, when they're kind of, their opinions are going to be like all over the map in terms of how they view the company. When people like you and I that are watching the shows each week, we have a really robust understanding of what it seems like the company is trying to project. But your less active fan and your less engaged fan is going to be uh, have a much more like scattershot view of the product. They might turn it on once and Orange Cassidy is on there doing his shtick, and that's their impression of AEW. And they might turn it on another time and Darby Allin's falling off a high structure, and that's their impression of AEW. And I think, we could talk all we want about the narratives of the company, but really there were a lot more other aspects in play. There's marketing that can reach fans who aren't tuning in each week. Um, I think a huge problem for AEW is the wrestling media and social media in general is skewered in like an anti AEW way. I don't know. I don't know. Suit, are you on Facebook at all?
Not anymore.
Right. I don't really use Facebook that much, but occasionally I'll load it up and just kind of scroll down. And Facebook to me is now like all these recommended pages, not even pages that I follow, just recommended pages. And I'll get wrestling ones, and like they're all like anti AEW wrestling pages. It's very strange that that's what the algorithm gives me. Um, and we know that's the case on Twitter, and we know that that's the case for like, people on YouTube that are maybe watching Jim Cornette talk about some old wrestling thing, and then the next thing that boots up is an angry Jim Cornette AEW rant, and that's that person's impression of AEW. I think all of these things play a factor in kind of like AEW's ability to cultivate new viewers and to find a new audience. And a lot of it stretches beyond just whatever it feels like the product is shifting in. And think sometimes we lose sight of that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and that goes back to my point of like AEW just needing more time to exist and be normal in the wrestling environment. Because, we're talking now, in January, that'll mark what, 5 years of AEW? Like 5 years since the announcement of AEW? Like 5 years it feels like a long time, but like that's not a long time when you're comparing it to WWE and the, historic, like they've been the New York territory for, God knows how long. Like, at least 60 years off that, probably further back. So AEW just is not normal to a large section of wrestling fans. So it's going to be seen as this just, kind of sideshow until it becomes normal. And that doesn't happen in 5 years. That happens, after maybe 10 years or 15 years of just being in the airspace where it just becomes normal now. And in, 5 more years, 10 more years, the wrestling fans that come into wrestling, like wrestling fans that haven't started that come into it, won't see it as this like sideshow. They'll just see it as like, oh, there's two companies. I like what this one does better. I like what that one does better. And that influence of like, well, yeah, that is tough because it will still be there. Because like a lot of fans will still stick around and like, those groups will still exist. That mindset will still exist. But my thought process is after, the more and more time passes, the more and more that automatic WWE influence kind of fades, and the more normal, you know, two companies existing next to each other will feel to wrestling fans in general.
Yeah, I think the most recent episode of WrestleNomics, Brandon brought up what I thought was a really good discussion in terms of the concept of a challenger brand or what an alternative brand is. And like the two examples we always seem to talk about in when it comes to AEW and WWE is like, Coke and Pepsi and McDonald's and Burger King. And the truth is there really isn't that much of a difference between Coke and Pepsi and McDonald's and Burger King. There are slight differences to the menu. Their food tastes slightly differently, but they basically are offering the same thing and targeting the exact same group of people. And is that really a challenger brand? On the flip side, he said like a more apt comparison to what AEW might be trying to do is like Coke and Red Bull, right? Red Bull is a very different drink than Coke. It is still a drink. You're still targeting kind of the same fan. Someone walks into a convenience store and wants a drink. Wonder what they're going to get. They'll look at, Coke, but they might also look at Red Bull. But, Red Bull is much more of an upstart company than Coke is. It's not, quite an institution the way Coke is or even what Pepsi is. Um, it targets a different audience through its marketing. It is, my grandma is not going to drink a can of Red Bull, but she'll probably drink a can of Coke. No one is going to drink a can of Red Bull and remember drinking a can of Red Bull 40 years earlier, like they will with Coke. There's no kind of institutional or nostalgia associated with it to that degree, similar to AEW's relationship with fans compared to WWE. And it's a much more interesting way, I think, to think about who are we targeting? Are we targeting a younger demographic? We're not going to target families as much. We're not going to be playing off of nostalgia as much the way WWE does. I think all of those are real questions that AEW, I'm sure, is asking themselves and should be asking themselves is what does it really mean to be an alternative and to cultivate new fans? Because it's probably not going to be, let's try to steal some fans from WWE. It has to be let's create our own fans from scratch and let's market and present ourselves to fan bases or populations that WWE has perhaps never targeted, or certainly generations that haven't been, targeted yet by WWE.
I think WWE has kind of given AEW like what their brand should be because, you know, as you know, forever they were sports entertainment, sports entertainment, sports entertainment. So AEW, like theoretically, you just go pro wrestling. We're pro wrestling. Like TNA for a while was We Are Wrestling. And I think like at least my thought process is okay, they're moving away from wrestling. They don't like to do blood. They do a lot of stunts, but they don't do like real violence. AEW will pivot this way, and they have. You know, we're a few months removed from that from a Texas death match on TV. So it's not that they aren't doing that. It's just that more and more there's some sports like there's sports entertainment vibes coming in, and that's muddying the waters. Like you want like a hard like demarcation point of okay, they do things like this. We don't do that over here. If we want to get something across, we'll find another way to do it. So at least that's my line of thinking on that. It could just be that confirmation bias hitting again, but
Yeah, well,
that's just my thought.
no, I think um hmm, I think with AEW, it's also like when we talk about like what the image of AEW is, and I think like people, who really don't like this MJF stuff, it kind of like overpowers all this other stuff that's happening in AEW. And I get that he's the champion, and I get that he's the most pushed commodity. So I get the complaints aimed at that. But when you look at a show like Wrestle Dream, their last pay-per-view show, and it's like, all right, we got the opening match was a very WWE specific match with MJF. It's the champion beating two tag team wrestlers in a handicap match. He's doing a lot of comedy, he's doing his bits. And it's like very WWE-like match. So it's like, okay, yes, that match was like WWE. It's like, was the rest of the card like WWE? Because I don't think WWE's having, Zack Sabre Jr. versus Bryan Danielson and having a match like that. I don't think they're doing a match like Darby Allin versus Christian Cage in the main event. Um, that to me was not like the rest of that show was not WWE like at all. And so it's like, all right, are we going to allow one thing, and you could throw in like the Tony Storm bit or something like that as another example of like sports entertainment and stuff like that. But are we really going to allow like this thing to kind of change the definition of what we think of the perception of AEW, or are we taking what something we really don't like and kind of projecting that as a bigger problem than it probably really is? And there are other problems in AEW that need to be addressed beyond just the MJF thing feeling like WWE. Because I feel like that's become the thing that sucks up all conversation in AEW now. Seems like all anyone ever talks about is the MJF angle, even while there's many, many, many other things happening in the company that are, not as sports entertainment y or WWE like. But it does seem like when it comes to like discussion about AEW, it's like I think some people are over exaggerating the impact that MJF has on the product. If that makes any sense.
It in a sense it is because it is like a couple people like it's MJF, it's Tony Storm, it's a like acclaimed or kind of in that vein, but they're
The
just more
acclaimed though are
goofy
kind
than
of
anything.
always like that.
Yeah, they've been like that. They're going to be like that. They're just they're a goofy team.
Yeah,
You
but
get like undercard at.
the acclaimed
Oh,
also have
go
things
ahead.
like they have like the edgy raps and stuff like that, which WWE would
Yeah,
never
there's that
allow.
too. You've got like low card acts like the Iron Savages on Collision and ROH doing their thing. Like it's more acts than it was before, but um like it is only a few acts out of like the sprawling company that is AEW. But at the same time, it's the world champion. It is the top act. It's the guy that's going to get the most time, the guy that's usually going to be in main events. So it's going to like it's like the head of a snake. It all goes down from him. Like it starts from him and it kind of seeps down in everything else. And I'm seeing a lot of like what I'm seeing, and I don't necessarily blame people for is like MJF's influence seeping into more of the card, even though like some of the acts, like the Iron Savages, don't matter. Like the Acclaim, that's always been their shtick. Like it was before MJF won the belt. When MJF loses it, they'll probably still be doing it. Tony, it's a new act for her, I guess. But a lot of people are kind of worried of MJF's influence at the top and hearing the reactions he's getting. They're worried about that kind of seeping through to the rest of the snake and like influencing more and more of the company when it hasn't on a large basis. Like you brought up Wrestle Dream, like I'll bring up All Out. It was a lot of the same thing where it's like MJF stuff is at the start. The rest of the show was, it was a vastly different like feel and flavor to it. Wrestle Dream, same thing. So it could just be a case of, if MJF loses the title to Jay White or if he loses it to, whoever they heat up next, Swerve, it could just be a feeling of once MJF loses the belt and he's not at the head of the, no, I'll go one for one and say once he's not at the head of the table anymore, things will, the feeling of the company will be different. The feeling of the company will be okay, we're all headed in this kind of one direction now.
Right, and there was this is something that's kind of evolved as MJF's face turn has evolved, right? Like we didn't have these
Yeah.
concerns when he was feuding with Bryan Danielson earlier this year. Even like the
Right.
Four Pillars feud, it wasn't, you could say there were some WWE elements, like all the guys in the ring talking, but it really, I don't think like we didn't see like, catchphrase MJF. This is really tied to
Yeah.
his babyface run, almost like his presentation of a babyface character is very sports entertainment-y, and his presentation of a heel character is not, or at least it's unique enough to not give off those same vibes.
Yeah, the four-way stuff didn't have like a WWE feel to it. It was just a clunky way of getting to a four-way world
Right,
title
and
match.
some of the guys were underwhelming as title challengers.
Yeah, and then once you get into the Adam Cole thing is where they start doing the pre-tapes, and that's where it feels more WWE, and that was kind of where MJF started, where his turn started with all the video stuff. Because if you remember, MJF and Cole, they did their back and forth. They had the 30-minute draw on Dynamite. That was fantastic. That was fantastic. Like these two can do, they can fit into the wider AEW world. It's just this way that they've gone about MJF's turn has, it's got a lot of those WWE elements to it that turn people off. And that's, it's why we're having the discussion now because the world title feud, the top two guys in the company are engaging in this. And now it just makes the show feel weird.
Yeah,
Even though it's not like, you know, even though it's not different from their stuff on, it being at the top and taking a lot of the oxygen is going to, you know, mess with things.
mm-hmm. Thinking kind of as we wrap up here, kind of like thinking big picture. Um, right now, if someone was say they had a basic knowledge of pro wrestling, but they came up to you on the street, suit, and they were like, "Suit, how would you describe AEW to me as a wrestling fan that doesn't really know that much about the company? What would your description be? Like, what would you tell someone about AEW?"
I would say it still feels like a pro wrestling company. Like it's very gritty. Like you'll get a lot of focus on the in-ring stuff, but there's a little tinge of like, WWE flavor. So you'll still get like comedy stuff. Like it's it's hard to put like it's hard to put it in like a simple phrase of this is what AEW is, because it feels like a variety of a lot of things. There is the like pro wrestling aspect of it where it's very focused on the in ring. Your pay-per-views will have, 11 matches. They won't waste a lot of time. The TV, on the other hand, like you'll get your good promos and you'll get your good matches, and it is hard to like encompass it in one like phrase. Like how would you describe it? And I can like kind of go off of what you would say.
For me, I describe it as it's a wrestling company where the main difference between AEW and WWE is that WWE's characters are cartoonish and over the top characters, while AEW's characters in general are more based in reality and they feel like they're more relatable people. That is not the case for everyone
Yes.
on the roster, right? That's not the case for MJF currently. But I still think the identity of the company, as opposed to WWE, is like the much more realistic depiction of characters and actions, while WWE is caught up in this really over the top cartoonish world, which appeals to historical WWE fans, but does not appeal to people who maybe want a more serious wrestling product. And that's what AEW offers. Now, there could be a tipping point where more acts are like MJF than not. And
Yeah.
then it becomes less of a distinction between the two companies. And it becomes harder to make that, summarization that I just did.
I get it. Okay, so going off of what you said, I would describe AEW like the way I would describe WWE is, it's the old I don't remember who said it, but someone once described WWE as a show a show about making a wrestling show. So it's like a look at how a wrestling show is made with these over the top characters and how everything comes together. And it's kind of cartoonish and it's kind of garish and it's got this veneer. Joe Lanza on the flagship had a very good term for it. He called it, just a plastic veneer on it. AEW doesn't have that veneer. AEW is a wrestling show. There are going to be different types of wrestling. Going to be different type of characters. Some of them are going to be over the top. Some of them are not. But the majority of the show is going to be about wrestling, who wins and loses, what goes on in the ring, and how these guys are getting. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that's that different than my explanation in terms of like it's a wrestling company as opposed to a sports entertainment company.
There you
Um,
go.
and I guess the distinction is a lot of people aren't familiar with what a wrestling company is like because their only knowledge is WWE.
Yeah, it's
Um,
been since WCW closed, it's been 22 years. I'm only 26. Like, there's a lot of people like me who are just like, they checked out TNA, but it's, been WWE or nothing for almost 30 years now. That's going to be hard. Well, that goes back to my point. It's going to be hard for AEW to overcome that in, the 4 years they've been running shows. It might take time for them to just grow and be normal in the wrestling environment.
yeah, like I'm 29 years old. I'm about to hit 10 years in my current professional field. Um, I do not remember WCW at all.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, so I think some fans, I mean, it's just a time thing, right? People don't realize how long ago 1999 was.
Yeah.
Um, as you get older. And so like that's something that I think a lot of people struggle with being able to remember. And I think that's how the company is going to, in like we kind of said at the top, it's going to take time to kind of establish that. But your vision kind of has to be consistent. Um, for all the things you can say about WWE since Vince McMahon Jr. came over and ran the company, is that his vision of pro wrestling, for the most part, has been relatively consistent. It's evolved from time to time, but what he thinks, what he values in pro wrestling, what he presents in his product has been very consistent for the last 40 years. Um, in AEW will need to have some level of consistency with evolution sprinkled in as well to kind of establish, I think, a similar reputation, even if it's probably never going to be quite as universal as WWE's.
I would agree with that.
All right, that's gonna put a wrap on today. Suit, you got anything you want to plug? Any recent work besides the MJF column or stuff you got upcoming?
Man, I've written a lot lately. I've got, well, you can follow me on Twitter and any Twitter offshoots at Suit Williams. Voicesofwrestling.com. I recently published the MJF piece that we talked about here. The Dynamite Dozen, which is my yearly look at the 12 best AEW television matches. You can check that out at voicesofwrestling.com. I also did an episode of The Good, the Bad, the Hungy, our AEW podcast, where I revealed the list live with Tyler and Fred. I've got an ongoing series about CM Punk because who doesn't love hearing about that guy? It's the bummer of Punk. It's the look at his 2011 rise to the main event in WWE. And then F4WOnline.com. I also write for the Wrestling Observer website. I review Ring of Honor every week, and I review AEW Collision every Saturday.
Yeah, so a lot of content throughout the week. Uh, it was a pleasure to have you on, Suit. And I thank all of my listeners, all the people that keep tuning in each week. Very appreciated, and everyone have a great weekend. And we'll talk to you after a while.